All right, everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. For today's show, rejoined by independent journalist Jeremy Hammond, whose work is truly phenomenal, and he just released a new ebook, the FDA COVID-19 vaccines and scientific fraud: how the U.S. government puts children's health at risk in service to the pharmaceutical industry. Jeremy, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for writing your book and making it a free ebook, by the way. I mean, it's so well researched and high quality that somebody could easily charge for it. So the fact that it's free and it's such a valuable resource, I think speaks to the testament of your character, one thing, but it's really a wonderful service. So thanks for coming on the show. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I always enjoy the conversations and where we end up going. So, I mean, I'd love to start with the ebook. And I was following along in your newsletter as you're kind of releasing the different stages about the research you were doing in regards to the FDA and its emergency use authorization for the children under 5 with the COVID vaccine. I just kind of wanted to start. What was in your research and in your findings? And obviously, you released this ebook, and it can go very in depth in terms of what you found. Just can you start with what the foundation do you feel that this decision was for the allowing of children to be under 5 to receive this vaccine? And you called it an act of scientific fraud, and I definitely agree with you, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and how it was actually rooted in that.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of fraud. So what I did was I just thoroughly reviewed the FDA's. They put out a decision memorandum which explains, which outlines their risk-benefit analysis and their reasoning for how they arrived at the conclusion that it would be safe and effective to administer this product to children as young as 6 months old. So previously, the FDA had already authorized vaccines for COVID-19 vaccines for children ages 5 to 11 and up. So this was for the under 5-year-olds. So from 6 months to 4 years. And so I just thoroughly reviewed that decision memorandum, and it's riddled with fraud. So there's a lot to cover, and I originally intended just to kind of write an article, and there's so much fraud in there. That's why it became an ebook, because it became too long to be a single article, and I just figured, well, I'll just make it something that people can download as a PDF, because there's so much fraud. But to get to your question, what's the kind of the core of it? The core of it is that the FDA didn't have any data demonstrating efficacy of this product in this age group. And so they relied on what they call an immunobridging analysis. So an immunobridging analysis is, okay, well, we already have reviewed data for the older kids, so we can use that, and we could, there's been demonstrated efficacy with older children, and therefore we can use that data to make an assumption about the efficacy for younger children. And so what they did is they measured antibody levels after administration of the vaccine, and then compared the antibodies in the younger age group with the antibody levels in the older age group. And since they were similar, they said, okay, well, therefore we can draw the conclusion that this vaccine is going to be effective for 6 months through 4-year-olds. But this is scientific fraud. I mean, you can't draw that conclusion. It's a non sequitur fallacy. Right. So the entire premise is literally a logical fallacy. The FDA knows this because a higher level of antibodies does not necessarily equate to immune protection. In fact, it's a consistent observation since the beginning of the pandemic is that people who develop a high level of antibodies is actually associated with severe disease. Whereas people who fare really well with the infection and have mild symptoms or never even develop clinical disease, they're infected with SARS-CoV-2, but they never develop COVID-19. Again, the important distinction between infection and disease. They tend to have very low levels of antibodies. In fact, some people recover from infection without even developing a detectable level of antibodies. So it's not a correlation that the higher the level of antibodies, the greater the protection. That just isn't true. The FDA knows this. One of the FDA's own members, Paul Offit, the member of its advisory committee, pointed this out, that that actually, for example, Moderna, when they were originally looking at the initial clinical trial data, Moderna did induce a higher level of antibodies than the Pfizer product, but that didn't translate into a greater effectiveness of Moderna over Pfizer. Right. So it wasn't clinically significant, as Offit put it. And he's pointed this out also with the, this is equally true with this immunobridging analysis, where, just because the younger children had a level of antibodies that was similar to the level of antibodies observed in the older children, we don't know what the clinical significance of that is. The FDA doesn't know the clinical significance of that. It doesn't know whether that's going to translate into effectiveness.
Gotcha.
And that's just the start of the fraud. I mean, that's just like, that's kind of the core of it. Yeah. But then if you start diving, you can go even further into that aspect. So for example, they only looked at antibodies at 1 month after administration. Actually, let me back up. The original protocol of the trial was for 2-dose primary series, just like, for every other age group. It's 2 doses, right? That was everyone else has been told that, you need 2 doses. That's the primary series. And then of course there's booster shots, but the primary series was 2-dose series in the protocol for the clinical trial. They changed the protocol mid-trial because the 2 doses were not getting, by the way, I'm looking at the decision memorandum specifically for the Pfizer vaccine. I didn't even get to the Moderna decision memorandum because I spent so much time just looking at the Pfizer data, and that it was so riddled with fraud. It took a great deal amount of time just to look at Pfizer. I don't have time to do Moderna as well, but there's similarities in terms of the fraud that was committed. But anyhow, so looking at the Pfizer vaccine, and with this immunobridging analysis, they only looked at 1 month. They changed the protocol to add a 3rd dose because the 2 doses were not getting Pfizer to the level of antibodies required to meet the FDA's criteria. And so they only look, and then they only looked at, even after that, so then they only looked at 1 month after the 3rd dose. And looking at antibodies 1 month after the 3rd dose. Well, the FDA knows that that's about the peak of antibody titers after vaccination. And after that, the FDA knows that antibody titers wane rapidly, which doesn't necessarily mean that people are losing, if antibodies, correlate with protection, which, antibodies do protect, they play an important role in what's called sterilizing immunity. So sterilizing immunity specifically refers to the ability of the immune system to generate antibodies that actually stop the virus before it can enter the cells and replicate inside of the cells. So that's called sterilizing immunity. Sterilizing immunity is what protects people from infection and transmission. But so early on, there was this claim that because people were losing their antibodies after an infection, you might remember back throughout the whole summer of 2020, as they built up the vaccine campaign while they were under development and study, and we were being told that natural immunity is short-lived and weak because look at this, people's antibodies wane rapidly after the acute phase of infection. Well, that's completely normal. It happens with every infection. So it doesn't necessarily translate into a loss of immunity because there's also there's immunologic memory. So we know this with natural immunity, it induces long-term immunologic memory, so that even if your antibodies do wane over time, which they don't, most people, they persist at low levels, sufficient levels. But upon reinfection, if you're ever exposed to the virus again, your body remembers how to generate those antibodies, and it can do it very rapidly. It doesn't have to go through that weeks-long process of learning how to generate antibodies that are effective against the virus. So anyhow, but at the same time, the FDA knows that there is a correlation between this loss of antibodies. They know this with all the other age groups, for which they've authorized these vaccines. That yes, that the actual immune protection, not just the antibodies are being lost, but the immune protection is being lost very rapidly. There was rapid waning of immunity with earlier variants, with the Delta variant. This was observed that after several months, people the sterilizing immunity wanes rapidly after several months. Then there was this debate about, well, should we give people boosters or not? Because of this, because vaccinated people are spreading the virus. Remember, the promise was they were sold to the public on the promise that 2 doses of one of these vaccines would induce durable sterilizing immunity. That would get us to herd immunity. And that was how we would be able to end the lockdowns and get life back to normal. That was how they were sold to the public. That was proven to be false. They do not induce durable sterilizing immunity. So there was this whole debate in the public health establishment about whether they should recommend boosters to people to kind of restore, the sterilizing immunity that is very transient. And the argument was that from people who said no, we shouldn't recommend boosters, was that, well, there's still protection against severe disease and death. So there's protection against severe disease, and suddenly they discovered cellular immunity. The whole time during the development process, they were saying, oh, just looking at antibodies and saying, oh, look, their antibody levels are dropping and therefore they're losing their immunity. But suddenly, when the same thing is observed with the vaccines, suddenly the scientists at the CDC, at the FDA, they discovered cellular immunity. And they said, oh, well, look, the protection against severe disease and death it lasts longer than the sterilizing immunity. So that was the whole argument. So anyhow, so they with this immunobridging analysis, they only measured at 1 month, despite knowing. Coming back to the point of there. So they eventually did, of course, decide that they're going to recommend boosters. Why? Because they observed also loss of immune protection against disease, severe disease and death. So that immune protection also wanes fairly rapidly. It is more durable than sterilizing immunity. Right. The protection against disease does outlast the sterilizing immunity, but it still wanes rapidly enough, like within a matter of several months. And that was with the Delta variant. With the Omicron variant, the duration of immune protection is measured in weeks, not months. It's weeks. The FDA knows this. And so looking at only 1 month and not looking at 2 months, 3 months, and what are the level of antibodies at 2 months out, 3 months out, 4 months out, 6 months out. I don't know how else to describe that other than scientific fraud.
Right.
And as if that's not bad enough, as if that's not deep enough, it goes deeper, because here's another huge element of scientific fraud. They measured antibodies against the original Wuhan strain of SARS-CoV-2, which is now extinct outside of laboratories. And
oh man,
and the FDA knows that the level of antibodies that were capable of actually neutralizing the Omicron variant, which is now predominant. In fact, there's subvariants of Omicron that are actually, in my understanding, are actually more genetically distant from the original Omicron variant than Omicron was from Delta.
Oh wow.
I mean, I believe that's the case. I think I read that someplace. I'm not absolutely certain of that, but I have read that. So I haven't verified that, but that's what I've read. And so the FDA actually had data from Pfizer. They actually queried Pfizer for data on this. And Pfizer gave them data showing that the level of antibodies that were capable of neutralizing antibodies against Omicron compared to the Wuhan strain or the Delta strain was 4 to 6 times lower. So the FDA knows that, and so it's reasonable, to draw the conclusion that had the FDA actually considered, for the purposes of meeting their criteria, they only looked at the antibodies capable of neutralizing the Wuhan strain. Had they changed their criteria to be scientifically reasonable had they used science and said, well, we need to measure the antibodies against the Omicron variant for the vaccine to be able to meet our criteria, had they done that, the vaccine would not have been able to they would not have been able to authorize the vaccine. So
Right.
again, knowingly authorizing this vaccine on the basis of the logical fallacy of equating a certain level of antibodies with immunity. And by the way, the FDA, in the decision memorandum, the FDA acknowledges that there is no correlative immunity, meaning that there isn't a certain level of antibodies that they know equates to immune protection. It hasn't been established. And of course, it's not just antibodies. It really is about a coordinated immune response that involves cellular T cells, cellular immunity, as well as B cells and antibodies. So it's not just about antibodies. And it's effective immune responses are very well coordinated immune responses. And the coordination is done with cellular immunity. It's the T cells that help coordinate. T cells are involved with the production of antibodies, but also have many other roles. And it's the B cells. So essentially they can instruct B cells to generate antibodies. And then it's the B cells that generate antibodies that are, that's where sterilizing immunity comes from. But T cells themselves are capable of destroying like infected cells, and they have many other purposes, including the orchestration of the immune response. And so, severe disease is really associated with dysfunctional cellular immunity.
Gotcha.
So, again, just to kind of review, so they looked at measuring the antibodies without established correlative immunity. They know there's no correlative immunity that's been established. So that's a logical fallacy to say, oh, well, they have this excellent level of antibodies and therefore they have immune protection. They know that's false. They know that's a logical fallacy. They measured only at 1 month, despite knowing rapid waning of antibodies, which actually does correlate with loss of immune protection in all the other age groups that they've observed. And then they know that the levels of antibodies capable of neutralizing the Omicron variant were 4 to 6 times lower than those observed against the Wuhan strain. And yet for the purposes of meeting their criteria for authorization, they only looked at the data for the Wuhan strain, which is extinct outside of labs. So, it's elements of fraud after fraud they're building like fraud on fraud on fraud with this whole immunobridging analysis.
Right.
And the fraud goes much, much deeper than just their immunobridging analysis. So looking at efficacy, they did have data on efficacy. So, there were, they had the vaccine group, they had the placebo control group, and they were collecting data on cases of COVID-19. They didn't generate enough data. There wasn't enough, the duration of the trial wasn't long enough, and or they didn't have enough subjects to be able to obtain statistically significant results by the time the FDA authorized the vaccine. So they authorized the vaccine with an absence of data demonstrating efficacy. And so Pfizer put out a press release claiming something like 80% efficacy. But that was not statistically significant. And if you look at the confidence intervals on that estimate, they go well into the negative.
Oh, wow.
Like I think it was a couple 100% negative.
Oh my gosh.
Up to, a certain percentage positive. Just very wide confidence intervals, and like completely, to look at those confidence intervals and conclude that, oh, well, we can be, reasonably certain that this vaccine is going to be effective. It is, again, that's completely unscientific. You cannot draw a conclusion with any confidence whatsoever. In fact, the data on efficacy are consistent with the hypothesis that the vaccines, the effectiveness of the vaccines is negative, which has been observed in real world data, looking at observational studies, estimating vaccine effectiveness over time. Again, there's a period of rapid waning, rapid loss of sterilizing immunity, followed by loss of protection against disease and death. And after several months of waning, negative effectiveness has been observed in numerous studies. Negative effectiveness, meaning that people who have been fully vaccinated are more likely to get COVID-19 than people who are unvaccinated. Now, how can this be? Well, there's a couple of explanations. Number one is natural immunity is superior. Natural immunity is an opportunity cost of vaccination. And so, when you're looking at unvaccinated populations at this point, most people have already been infected. Most people who have not been vaccinated have already got natural immunity, which is superior. And so when you're comparing, essentially, when these days, when you're doing a study comparing vaccinated versus unvaccinated, it's effectively a study of vaccine immunity versus natural immunity. And so this can explain negative effectiveness. Moreover, studies have shown that a phenomenon called original antigenic sin is a real problem with COVID-19 vaccines. So original antigenic sin has been known about, it's first written about, as far as I know, back in the 1960s. So they've known about this for decades. And what happens is that the initial priming of the immune system can prejudice the immune response to subsequent exposures to a pathogen, to a virus. So this can happen with infection or vaccination. It's been observed with influenza, both infection and vaccination. A key difference being that it's a greater problem with the vaccine than it is with natural immunity, because the natural immune response is broader and more adaptive than the vaccine immune response. And the same is true with SARS-CoV-2 infection. Original antigenic sin has been observed in limited cases with infection with SARS-CoV-2, with cases where there's severe disease. And again, in circumstances of dysfunctional cellular immunity, there has been observed that the initial priming of the immune system by infection resulted later when they were re-exposed to a different variant. Some people failed to mount an effective immune response to the variant because their immune systems were stuck generating an immune response to the original variant that they were infected with. Okay, so this is what happens. The immune system gets fixated on generating a suboptimal immune response relative to the immune response of an immunologically naive individual.
Right.
And so, but generally with natural immunity, apart from cases of like dysfunctional immune responses, most people develop develop immunity that is adaptive. So you might have been infected with the Wuhan strain initially, and then later you were infected with Delta, and it wasn't the case that your immune system was stuck generating an immune response to the original Wuhan strain. The immune system adapted, and it learned how to adapt the antibody response to be specific to the Delta variant. And so adaptability is observed with natural immunity. This is not the case with vaccine-induced immunity. There really is a very strong fixation of the immune system to generate immune responses to the original Wuhan strain, because of course the vaccines were designed to elicit antibodies to the spike protein of the original Wuhan strain of the virus. Now, this brings us to the booster campaign that they've now authorized the boosters, right?
Yeah.
That they contain an Omicron component. So the message to the public is, oh, well, now there's an updated vaccine. It's going to protect you against Omicron. It's going to cause your body to generate immune responses to Omicron. FDA knows that's not true. Because going back to the immunobridging analysis, they asked Pfizer for data. They looked at, I think it was Wuhan strain, the Delta strain, and the Omicron strain, and they measured antibodies against neutralizing antibodies. So antibodies that were actually neutralizing, capable of like binding with the, in the lab. They do these studies, capable of binding with any of those variants. Now, just because there was binding with Omicron, again, it was like 4 to 6 times less.
Yeah.
But that there was some binding with the Omicron variant. But studies looked at that. It's not because the vaccines generate immune responses specific to Omicron. It's just that this immune responses are still, the antibodies are still specific to the original spike protein of the original Wuhan strain. It's just that there's cross-reactivity.
Okay.
Right? Because, the spike proteins of Wuhan compared to the Omicron variant. Of course, the Omicron variant has many mutations in the spike protein. In fact, when it was first discovered, there was a lot of alarm about this. And oh my gosh, there's so many mutations. It's going to evade people's immunity, which is largely true. It does evade your immune responses, particularly sterilizing immunity. It does evade the antibodies, whether from infection or vaccination, to a large degree. But there is still cross-reactivity. And so all they're measuring is cross-reactive antibodies. The FDA knows this, but they're putting out this communication to the public as though people are going to be able to generate antibodies specific to the Omicron variant. And I'm still awaiting them to release data showing that actually that with these new Omicron-based boosters that contain an Omicron component as well as the original Wuhan strain. I'm waiting for them to show evidence that these boosters actually can induce, remember, people's immune system, they're booster shots. Yeah. So everyone who's getting one of these vaccines, the Omicron-based vaccines, has already been fully vaccinated with, against the original Wuhan strain. So their immune systems are already fixated on that immune response because of original antigenic sin, which they know has happened. It's been proven in the scientific literature. There's been numerous studies now proving that that original antigenic sin is real. It's happening. And so they know that this is the case. And so, where's the data showing that, that's actually specific immune antibodies specific to the Omicron spike protein, as opposed to being specific to the Wuhan strain with some cross-reactivity. There's a very important distinction, and you notice that they never talk about that. They always say, well, there's a higher level of antibodies to the Omicron variant, which is deceptive because it's not antibodies specific to the Omicron variant. It's antibodies specific to the spike protein of the original Wuhan strain that happened to cross-react. Very important distinction. So again, that's another fraud, apart from the fraud with the 5 to 11-year-olds, or I'm sorry, the 6 months to 4-year-olds, and now with the booster campaign that they've got, authorizing the booster shots with no data from clinical trials in humans, no data.
Right.
Zero data.
You'll be waiting for that data for a long time. I don't think it's going
right. Well, and this is another aspect. That's another aspect of the fraud. Again, with the the decision memorandum, the FDA made sure that we were never going to have data from clinical trials from which we can draw conclusions about vaccine safety or efficacy. In fact, by the time the FDA issued its authorization for emergency use in infants and toddlers, which of course there's no emergency for infants and toddlers, for children. As everyone knows, there's no emergency with COVID-19 for infants and toddlers and adolescents.
Right.
But anyhow, by the time they issued this authorization, they were already vaccinating away the placebo group in the trials. A substantial proportion of the participants in the placebo control group had already been vaccinated by the time the FDA issued its authorization. So they unblinded trial participants and offered them vaccination.
Wow.
And so, and by the time, and they started to do this because, again, remember they changed the protocol. The initial 2-dose, it was initially supposed to be 2 doses, and then they realized that wasn't working. It wasn't getting them to their criteria. Even only looking at 1 month later of antibodies, and even only looking at antibodies against the Wuhan strain, they couldn't reach the level that they needed to reach the FDA's criteria. And so they changed it to the 3-dose protocol. And so the participants in the placebo control group, after that change of protocol, they began vaccinating them away as of August.
Wow.
So we will never have data from this trial from which we can really reasonably draw any conclusions
Right.
firmly about the safety or effectiveness
Wow.
of the shot in that age group. And then FDA went further and made it clear that that any future COVID-19 vaccines, including obviously this Omicron booster shot, will not have to undergo clinical trials. They made that clear at the time, essentially saying that because they're basically relying on the initial clinical trials and saying, well, because we've already authorized the Pfizer and Moderna shots for these age groups, or certain age groups, it's actually been completed the full approval process and actually been licensed. But then, as far as I know, like I don't know, for some time, and this might still be true, that the actual Comirnaty is the name of the actual approved product, right?
I believe
the
that's
Pfizer
still
product
true.
is
Yeah.
Comirnaty.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, that it's actually still not being distributed in the U.S.
Yeah.
So
That's
as
right.
far as I believe it's still true to this day that all of the COVID-19 vaccines being administered inside the United States are actually being administered under emergency use authorization, not under full approval.
Yeah. I believe that's correct.
And that's relevant because even though the products, the EUA product versus the approved product are, substantially similar, there are some differences. The FDA has talked about that, which, won't get into. It's complicated, but and I don't fully understand all it myself. It has to do with the mRNA and how they develop the spike protein and whatnot. But the EUA, with EUA status, the manufacturers have complete legal immunity.
Right.
And so if they were to administer vaccines under full approval as opposed to under the EUA status, the manufacturers could be held legally liable for vaccine injuries.
Right.
And so that's the significance of the fact that even though they say, well, these are FDA approved products, as far as I know, for a long, and it was true for a long time, and I think it's still true today, that they're all administered under emergency use authorization, meaning that the manufacturers, if you get harmed by these products, you can't sue them.
Yeah, that's still definitely the case. And from what I've heard about, I think in terms of the childhood vaccinations, and maybe you can confirm this or speak on it, when a vaccine is added to the childhood vaccination regular schedule as it is, that adds a layer of protection for the vaccine companies itself, as opposed to if it's just for adults, let's say, right? So they're adding in these COVID shots for kids. And if that were to become approved down the line, there's a certain level of legal protection they have from the damages that it causes, from what I understand.
Yeah, you see what they're trying to do. They're trying to leap from EUA status, under which they have legal immunity granted by the government, straight to approved products that also have legal immunity. And the way to do that is to get these shots into the arms of children.
Right.
Because, as you correctly described, once a vaccine becomes recommended for children on the CDC's routine childhood schedule, those products, then the manufacturers of those products, then by virtue of the CDC's recommendation, have legal immunity. And that's under a 1986 law, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which was passed in the mid-80s at a time when vaccine manufacturers were actually going out of business because of vaccine injury lawsuits, particularly with the DTP vaccine, the diphtheria, tetanus, whole cell pertussis vaccine, which has since been discontinued in the US, precisely because it was so reactogenic. It was causing so many, severe adverse events. And they replaced it with the safer acellular pertussis vaccine. But anyhow, there was a lot of injury lawsuits going on, and they were manufacturers actually going out of business as a result. And so, the vaccine supply was being threatened by these lawsuits. So public vaccine policy was being threatened by lawsuits. So Congress stepped in, granted legal immunity to the manufacturers, and established the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the VICP, which is supposed to be a way for people who are injured by vaccines to be able to, get compensation. in lieu of being able to sue the manufacturers.
Mhm.
But of course, it doesn't really work that way. The VICP is not an effective way for people to get compensation for. I mean, people can get compensation, but it's not the way they describe it as an easy way for people to get compensation for vaccine injuries. It's not. It's a cumbersome, burdensome process, and most people are not able to get compensation. But that's a different topic. But so they established the VICP and granted legal immunity. So yeah, you can see what they're trying to do with the COVID-19 vaccines. They're trying to skip any period of time in which the manufacturers could be sued,
Right.
by jumping from EUA to full approval with a CDC recommendation for children.
Right, and that grants them, it gives them, because if let's say they had even just one moment where they could be held legally liable. If you look at
The floodgates would open.
yeah,
They can't have that.
exactly, there can't be a moment where that exists. And everything that you talked about in terms of the scientific fraud, the f- it's almost unbelievable to think about. We haven't even touched on, I would say, well, what is the vaccine almost risk benefit analysis of if you're going to get in, like, are you more at risk of an injury when you get the shot and compared to even just COVID, right? And that's something we haven't even touched on yet in depth, and we've already established how much of a scientific fraud it is based on
Precisely.
antigenic sin. So
Yeah,
it's
no, because of course the FDA, again, to try to justify its authorization of this product, they talked about long COVID in kids and MISC in kids, and these other consequences apart from death. They talked about death in children, and at every single point that they raised, they downplayed the very low risk to children and exaggerated the risks, again, including outright fraud, including outright fraudulent claims. So for example, with the risk of long COVID in children, they exaggerated this risk by citing a survey done by the UK government, estimating over 7% of children having long-term symptoms after a COVID-19 diagnosis. But if you actually go and read that paper, if you go and read the FDA source, they say right in there that you cannot use this data to draw conclusions about the prevalence of long COVID because it wasn't a study properly designed to determine that, like by controlling, because there's a lot of variables and factors that you needed to be controlled for. And if you look at studies that are actually, in fact, there was a systematic review of the literature on long COVID. And what they found was that the lower quality studies estimated very high prevalence of long COVID, whereas the higher quality studies that included control groups estimated very low prevalence of long COVID. And there's been numerous studies pointing out how you have to control for like the negative health consequences of the lockdowns.
Yeah.
A lot of the symptoms people are describing and attributing to SARS-CoV-2 infection overlap with just symptoms of stress and maybe poor health behaviors as a result of stress and the negative health effects of the mental effects of lockdowns. And so you have to control for that. And so looking at another study, for example, found that just the belief that one has had an infection with SARS-CoV-2 was associated with a higher rate of self-reported symptoms of long COVID, right? Even though those people actually tested negative. So just because they believed that they had been infected with SARS-CoV-2, even though there was no serological evidence that they had been infected, was associated, with a higher rate of like long-term symptoms.
Wow. So,
there's this fear, there's a psychological effect of the fear that has been instilled in people of this virus. And that psychological trauma alone can account for a portion of these, reported long-term symptoms. Which
Mm.
is not to say that long COVID does not exist. I'm firmly convinced that it does. There are people who do have long-term symptoms as a result of the infection. But again, another study found that the only one for which there was actually a statistically significant difference was loss of taste and smell.
Mm. Right.
And so, the FDA, had claimed to have done this thorough, robust analysis. And here they are citing this one source, which specifically states you can't use that data to estimate the prevalence, to make any assumptions about the prevalence of long COVID.
Mm.
And the FDA is using that and inferring that over 7% of children might have, may have long COVID, completely ignoring this entire body of literature that has demonstrated that actually the higher quality studies showing that the prevalence is actually a lot lower than initially assumed.
Right.
And there's a lot of other factors that have to be controlled for.
Right.
So anyhow, there's one aspect. And another one they claimed, I think it was MISC, multi-inflammatory syndrome in children,
Mm-hmm.
Which has been associated with COVID-19. It can be caused by COVID-19. It's a rare condition, can be life-threatening. And the FDA was citing a paper on MISC, and according to the FDA, the study showed a 16-fold greater risk of being diagnosed with MISC for people who were also diagnosed with COVID-19, as opposed to people who did not have a COVID-19 diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
16-fold greater risk. Turning to the paper, again, checking the FDA's own sources, they did not report a 16 times greater risk. It was an 8 times greater risk. So the FDA doubled the risk, falsely claimed it was 16 when it was 8. Secondly, the authors of that study specifically emphasized the need to not only report that relative increased risk,
Mm-hmm.
but also to report the absolute increased risk, which was very low. So yes, just because they did find that compared to children without a COVID-19 diagnosis, children with a COVID-19 diagnosis had an 8 times greater risk of being diagnosed with MISC. True, that's it's an increased relative risk. But the risk of that happening was still very, very low, something less than 1%. And I don't remember the exact fraction of a percent, but it was very low. And they pointed this out, and they said that it's very important to emphasize to people, because when you say, an 8 times greater risk, it sounds like, oh my gosh, that's such a high risk, right?
Right.
When you put it in perspective of the absolute risk, it's still, the chances of that happening are still extraordinarily low. And so they emphasize that when policymakers and public health people talk about the risk, it's absolutely imperative that you also explain the absolute risk, that it's still a very low risk. And what did the FDA do? Completely ignored that part of the paper.
Of course.
Did not report the absolute risk, cherry picked, picked out the relative risk only, and then doubled it and reported it as doubled what the study actually reported. And the FDA knows that this is deceptive. The FDA, several years back, the FDA put out a guidance document for the medical establishment, where they explain how, it says right in there, absolute risk is always more informative.
Wow.
And only reporting relative risk without absolute risk can be highly misinformative. This is what the FDA said in its own guidance document. So the FDA knows that when it takes this relative risk, doubles it from what was actually reported in the study, and omits the absolute risk. It knows it's being deceptive. The FDA knows it's being deceptive when it's deliberate deceptiveness.
Yeah.
And the 16-fold versus the 18-fold, maybe that was human error. Maybe they just accidentally, whoops, we said 16, it was 8, whoops, sorry. But the fact that they omitted is the fact that the study authors specifically emphasized the need to also report absolute risk, and the FDA withheld that figure. That's deliberately deceptive.
Right. Definitely a scientific malpractice and fraud, to put it mildly. It wasn't enough to just cherry pick the data. They had to manipulate the data that they did choose to use. So
you begin to see what I mean when I say that this document is just riddled with fraud, and it goes so deep. Like every single point that the FDA made, every single argument that the FDA made is essentially scientifically fraudulent.
Right. Right. And what about we hear a lot about myocarditis as well. And, prior to COVID even being a thing, I mean, obviously myocarditis it existed, but we have seen I'd say almost a tenfold increase. Maybe that's not the statistically accurate number. I don't know exactly the percentage, but a very noticeable, observable increase in myocarditis, adults, young males in particular, but also children as well. What did they say about myocarditis at all? And in terms of receiving the vaccine, is a child who receives it more at risk from myocarditis from the shot itself than actual, like, the harms of COVID or the potentials of getting myocarditis from COVID, like they have tried to claim?
Actually, you know what? I just I just had to look at my document, and I was mistaken. I actually just described what they said for myocarditis.
Oh, okay.
The 16-fold greater risk. I just taking a look. Sorry, my apologies.
Oh,
That
no
was
worries.
actually myocarditis. So So MISC was actually a different argument. With MISC, apologies again. They claim that it's a rare but serious condition that occurs in less than 1% of children.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's come back to MISC and actually correct that.
Yeah.
So less than 1%. So on one hand, you could say, oh, well, that may make it sound like it's not very common. It's pretty rare by saying it's less than 1%. But if you think about it, what they're saying is that it's something approaching 1 in 100 children.
Mhm.
Well, that's not all that rare. And so by actually saying that, they're actually being highly deceptive, because they're pulling that figure. It's not an actual estimate. They cite, again, I check the sources, right? Just go to the
Yeah.
sources and see what the sources say. So I did that, and they actually miscite their sources. They take the authors and the journal of one paper and the title of a different paper and put them together, and that's what they cited. So the paper they cited doesn't actually exist, but I managed to find the actual two papers that they conflated. And they didn't present an estimate of MISC.
Mm.
The CDC had an estimate of MISC because in another one of its sources that it cited for a completely different purpose, it provided an estimate of MISC, which was not something approaching 1 in 100. I think it was something like approaching like 1 in 3,000.
Oh, wow.
Something like that. And so, it was a fraction of it. It wasn't, less than 1%. Makes it sound like it's something approaching 1 in 100 when it actually was just a fraction of a percentage. And so even though, on its face, it might seem like they're acknowledging a low risk, they're actually exaggerating the risk by saying that, like significantly exaggerating the risk. And so that was what they did with MISC. And then coming back to what I described before, mistakenly misrecalling that as being for MISC. Again, my apologies. That was actually for myocarditis.
Gotcha.
And so, which brings us to actually, might as well mention this. There was a paper, researchers in Thailand looking at adverse cardiovascular events following the second dose of Pfizer vaccine in adolescents. And they reported 29% of participants in their study experienced adverse heart effects.
Wow.
29%. Now, many of those could be very mild. This is not myocarditis. It's just, adverse heart effects. Excuse me. But then looking at heart inflammation, which includes myocarditis and pericarditis,
Mhm.
So myocarditis is inflammation of the heart muscle, and then the pericarditis is inflammation of the tissue surrounding the heart. So they're both two different types of heart inflammation. Looking at myocarditis, pericarditis, there were 7 participants out of 301 that were diagnosed with heart inflammation. So that's 1 in 43.
Mm.
Dr. Simone Gold, who is the founder of the organization America's Frontline Doctors, reported that on Twitter. She linked to the study. She accurately said that about 1 in 3, 29% rounds to 1 in 3, 1 in 3 participants had heart effects. And by the way, the researchers of the study, they took baseline measurements. They used, there was 11 or 12 different criteria that they used to define cardiac manifestation. They took baseline measurements before the shot. And then they took measurements at several time points. I think it was 2 or 3 time points after the shot.
Mhm.
So they had baseline measurements like before and after.
Right.
So this is very strongly vaccine associated observations. Of course, it doesn't prove causality. It was an observational study. And there was no control group. But still very concerning findings that is very highly vaccine associated cardiovascular effects, including 1 in 43 participants diagnosed with heart inflammation.
Right.
So Gold actually accurately reported that on Twitter. Reuters put out a fact check
Of course.
claiming that she was spreading misinformation. On what basis? So they argued that it wasn't 1 in 3, it was 1 in 6 who had heart effects detected by electrocardiogram, ECG.
Mm-hmm.
But ECG was only one of the 11 criteria that the study authors used to define cardiac manifestation. So that wasn't the total number of children, so all the children who had, abnormal ECGs, that wasn't the total number of children who had observable adverse heart effects.
Mm.
So Reuters is lying. It was 1 in 3, and that was stated right in the abstract of the study. Right in the abstract, 29%. Reuters completely ignored that, failed to report it, omitted that fact from its, hoax fact check. The second argument that he used with the 1 in 40 said it wasn't 1 in 43. There was only 1 confirmed case of myocarditis. So that's 1 in 301, not 1 in 43, as falsely claimed by Gold. Again, no.
Right.
There were 7. Gold didn't. So this is a straw man argument. You can see how Gold never claimed. They're using straw man argumentation. Gold never claimed that 1 in 3 had adverse heart effects detected by ECG.
Yeah.
She didn't say that. She didn't say 1 in 43 were diagnosed with myocarditis. She never made that claim. So they're fact checking a claim she never made. She accurately said heart inflammation. That includes myocarditis, myopericarditis, and pericarditis.
Yeah.
And so there was 1 confirmed case of myopericarditis, which is when they say myocarditis, it was actually a case of myopericarditis. It was an inflammation of both the heart and the tissue surrounding the heart in that 1 patient. But there were also cases of subclinical myocarditis, meaning that these patients had, detectable, with measurements, detectable evidence of heart inflammation. It just never manifested as like symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
They never, the patients perhaps never, had any, they weren't aware of what was going on. They didn't have symptoms, like where they felt chest pain or something. So that's what subclinical myocarditis is. So there were a number who were diagnosed with subclinical myocarditis, which can be very concerning. In fact, there's literature on how subclinical myocarditis is associated with sudden death in athletes. And then also, a number of diagnoses of pericarditis. So in total, there were 7. 7
Right.
out of 301 is 1 in 43.
Yeah.
So Reuters, again, they have this misdirection.
Yeah.
And they're essentially arguing against a straw man argument, omitting certain facts from the paper, and in claiming that that's a fact check, and claiming that Gold was spreading this information. In fact, it was Reuters that was spreading this information, and Gold's tweet was accurate. It was accurately reported.
Right. Well, I
Um,
guarantee you Reuters didn't put the actual study in there so people could go and read the data for themselves because they'd see,
they
right?
may have linked to it, but a lot of times it's like they don't expect people to actually check sources.
Mm,
It's like, going back a few years ago, I had a big multi-part series on the flu shot. And that really got kicked off when I read an article in the New York Times by Aaron Carroll on the flu shot and how wonderful the flu shot is. And he said that there was a Cochrane collaboration that does systematic, they specialize in systematic reviews of the literature. And he said there was a Cochrane review that showed that the flu shot confers a huge public health benefit.
mm,
So go and read the source, you read the Cochrane review, read the couple 100-page document. No, they didn't conclude that at all. In fact, they concluded just the opposite of that. They concluded that what they actually concluded was that the underlying assumptions of the CDC's universal flu shot recommendation are unsupported by scientific evidence.
wow.
So is that saying, well, the flu shot has a proven huge public health benefit? I mean, I don't know how he got that out of actually reading the paper, because it's not what, in fact, the authors of that paper went so far in their criticism of the CDC that they accused the CDC of deliberately misrepresenting the science to support their policy. And here Carroll is citing this paper to support his claim that it found that the flu shots confer a huge public health benefit. I mean, it's absolutely absurd, but this is so common. This is an example off the top of my head of how, often people cite sources, in the mainstream media, they cite sources. They put links in there. Carroll put the link right in there to the Cochrane review, but it's like he never read it himself. And I don't know how he could have even possibly, even by like scanning it or something, how he could have possibly taken away that review found that the flu shot confers a big public health benefit. No idea how he got that out of it. And it's just an outright lie. It's a blatant lie. But this is just so common. I mean, it's just so, I mean, you read my articles, people who follow my work, and it's pretty much what I do.
Yeah.
I mean, like virtually all of my articles, it's like, this is what the media are saying. Here are the sources they cite. Here's what the sources actually say. I mean, probably at least half my articles, I debunk the claims just by looking at their own sources cited.
Right.
So this is very common. It's very routine. They don't expect people to actually check sources, and this is why it's really very important. As news consumers, when you see a claim being made that you're skeptical of, click that link, go check out the sources. And yeah, it takes extra time. You got to put the time into doing the research, but knowledge is so empowering. You have to know what the truth is, and if you want to know what the truth is, you got to check primary source materials.
Exactly. Well, it astounds me that I guess they would even put the original source in there. And if you just by clicking it, and if you read the abstract, you read just the conclusion. You don't have to be a fully literate scientist, like doing these types of studies and know exactly what all of it even means.
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you for making that point. Yes, because any layperson could just click the link and just read just the abstract of the study, and it says right in there 29%. That's a very good point. Reading scientific studies can be it's burdensome. There's a lot of technical language, a lot of things that are just way over my head, way over most people's head. But once you start kind of doing that, once you start kind of reading scientific studies, reading studies kind of routinely, you learn to understand them. You don't understand all the technical details, like when I talk about cellular immune responses and things, I'm not an immunologist. There's so much about immunology. It's way over my head. I don't understand a lot of it, but I get the gist of it.
Yeah.
I get that antibodies don't equate to, to immunity.
Mhm.
I get that there's a lot more to it than that. I get that there's T cells that also play an important role. You can understand the basics. You can get the key points. You can understand the main idea. And so, you might be glossing over a lot of like the technical details in a study, but as long as you can read a paper and you take away the main points and the key points, that is a skill that anyone can develop. Any layperson can develop that skill.
Yeah.
And so, and I try to kind of teach people how to develop that skill in my articles, because I don't want to just give people information. I don't want people just to accept what I'm saying. I want people to go check out my sources and verify that I'm accurately reporting, and accurately characterizing the sources that I cite. And so I kind of I try to also walk people through my own thinking, that this is my logic, this is my reasoning, this is how I arrive at my conclusions. And I'm just going to state my conclusion and cite a source and have it be that. Like, I want people to understand my train of thought, including how I, read studies and how I pull out the key pieces of information. Even if there's a lot of, if you go through the methodology, or not methodology, but that you go through the typically a paper will have a number of sections. You have the abstract, and then the introduction, and then you have the methodology section, and then the paper describing what the section actually describing what they do, and then the results. And that middle section can be very highly technical in terms of, these are the actual technical steps that we went through. A lot of times you kind of just gloss through that section because it's most of it is way over your head. But you can at least go through the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusions, and the discussion in the conclusion section, and that's kind of written in more layperson's language, and you can at least take away the key points from that. So it's very, very important for the layperson to be able to open up a study and look at it and not be intimidated by it, and check it out for yourself. Especially, at least read the abstract, because again, as you just pointed out, in this case, that's all anyone would have to do to see that it's actually Reuters that's being deceptive.
Right. Exactly. And I think there's a reason Pfizer wanted to wait, what was it, 75 years to actually release their data,
Yeah.
because I think more people are starting to take this approach where they want to see the data themselves. I mean,
Yeah.
to a certain level, maybe not everybody, but of course, you have people who still follow the New York Times as the spoken word of everything that is pure and true, right? There's going to be people who that is their go-to source of information because that's all they've ever known to where to go. And but I think I would say the truth is becoming more apparent just in the reality of what are these shots doing to people, right? What is the actual risk that when you go outside, like, do you truly feel at risk at this point? And I mean, I'm in a highly touristy area, so I still see people. I saw a double mask just the other week. I didn't think people were still doing that, but it exists, right? And people, um, I guess people will assess their risk as it is, but I think a lot of people are beginning to recognize that the risk that they were sold over the last few years is nowhere near what they said like the risk that is present is nowhere near what they were sold. So just looking at one of the most telling pieces in your ebook for me was to actually hear the people from the FDA or the CDC talk about themselves, their own sort of opinion. And I recall one of the people saying they were proud to have once said that they worked at the CDC, but now they'd be embarrassed to tell somebody that they're working at the CDC, right? So I think
Yeah.
even in these organizations, people are starting to understand what's going on, and it's a very small number of people who are, I would say, at the top of this ladder and perpetrating this fraud. But those who are, maybe a step below them, they're not up in the same level in the hierarchy within the CDC, and so they don't have a way to actually stop this from happening or expose the truth. I mean, there was I'm blanking on the CDC whistleblower's name from years back on
William
vaccine.
Thompson.
William Thompson, yeah. There's an example of a CDC whistleblower coming out, but again, what was the impact on that? I mean, the truth came out, but Did it create significant levels of change within the CDC? Not necessarily. So there isn't a lot of power that I think a lot of these people, even even maybe the scientists who are doing the studies and wanting to bring out the truth, right? They don't necessarily have power over what gets done with that data. So
No.
um,
And they have their careers. I mean, they spoke. That's why they spoke out anonymously. So you're referring to in my ebook, just for your listeners to understand. I go over Dr. I think his name was Marty Makary.
hmm,
Um, he was approached, evidently, him and his co-author on this article that they had written were approached by officials from the FDA, from the CDC, who came out and spoke on the condition of anonymity about their concerns over the lack of, essentially the FDA had stopped even pretending to do science, right?
yeah, yeah,
So they're concerned about this. And so they're speaking, on this condition of, speaking anonymously, expressing their concerns about this. But, one of them actually, mentioned, I need to at least get through my, I need to get through my term here with them before I speak out or something, or,
mhm,
like they're afraid to lose their jobs. They're afraid for their careers, that if they say something publicly, if they let their names be known, that there's going to be consequences and they're going to be harmed by that, so that they can't speak out. This speaks to how this type of fraud is able to persist
mm,
and is perpetuated. And of course, the FDA's fraud, for example, using antibodies as a surrogate measure of immunity, goes way back.
yeah,
It's not just the COVID-19 vaccines. In fact, the FDA cited the precedent with other vaccines of having done this, where they didn't have proven in clinical studies, like proven efficacy. They would measure antibodies
right,
and use an antibody titer as a surrogate measure of immunity, and say, okay, well, we generated X amount of antibodies, therefore we can jump to the assumption that this vaccine is going to be effective. So the FDA cited the precedent of doing that in the past to justify doing it in the present. But of course, just because the FDA has committed scientific fraud in the past doesn't mean it's okay to commit scientific fraud now.
uh,
But yeah, there's this, kind of going back to the point you were making a moment ago, before talking about the CDC and FDA officials coming out and speaking on this condition of anonymity, their concerns. There has been kind of this mass awakening. I think this is one of the benefits. This is one of the positive outcomes of the whole pandemic, is this mass awakening and realization that the quote unquote public health establishment, public health officials, are completely unworthy of our trust.
yeah,
And this awakening has manifested in the vaccination rates for children under 5,
yeah,
which, the media report as being abysmally low and frighteningly low. But I look at that and I say, oh, wow, that's great. People are waking up. They're thinking for themselves. They're doing their own research.
yeah,
And they're exercising their own judgment, and they're trusting their own judgment over the judgment of people at the FDA, and over the judgment of people at the CDC, and over the judgment of the clowns at the New York Times and the Washington Post and wherever else. They're thinking for themselves, and they're saying, you know what? I'm not going to vaccinate my child. I don't care what anyone else says. I'm going to
mhm,
trust my own judgment on this. That's
yeah,
right there in the data on vaccine uptake for children under 5.
right, absolutely. And I think I don't remember exactly where this study was, but I remember reading, and I would need to go and confirm the author and all of this, but how sudden infant death syndrome, the mysterious sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS,
Yep.
actually dropped these last few years as there was a decline in the, like you just mentioned, um, having children follow the regular childhood vaccine schedule, right? And so
Mhm.
obviously I don't know if there's the data to say that's the exact cause of the decline in death, but one can start to connect dots and see how, you have this mysterious illness called sudden infant death syndrome, which uh, is, there's a lot of evidence pointing to
Yeah,
vaccines.
there was I don't remember what the organization was, but there was a group that put out a paper looking at that, because during the lockdowns,
Yeah.
Vaccination rates plummeted, right? People weren't taking their kids to go get vaccinated. They weren't going to the hospitals, they weren't going to clinics. And this not just in the US, globally, there was vaccination rates plummeted.
Yeah.
And so this group looked at data on vaccination rates and in SIDS and showed that as vaccination, the reported rates of SIDS were in decline. But my interpretation of that was, was fairly preliminary. That was, I think, I don't know if that was 2020 or 2021 when I saw that paper.
Mm-hmm.
So that was quite preliminary. It wasn't really conclusive, but it was compelling.
Yeah.
And I would like to see more current data. That's the most, I haven't seen any more current data on that. Like whether, what did happen with that. I would really I'd be curious to see, in terms of, decline in vaccination rates, being associated with rates of SIDS, and whether that decline continued and whether it really did manifest in the data as an association. Obviously not necessarily causal.
Yeah.
We don't want to jump to the conclusion,
Right.
but certainly it could be compelling evidence that there's reason for concern. And of course, there's other studies in the literature. For example, there was a paper that as I recall, it's been quite a few years since I looked at it, but as I recall, they compared rates of SIDS in different countries, and then in comparison to the different vaccine schedules in those countries.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a correlation between the more highly vaccinated countries having higher rates of SIDS, as an example. Again, doesn't prove that the vaccines cause SIDS, but they showed that there was a correlation there.
Right.
And of course, there's biological plausibility.
Right. Exactly. Well, and it's finding the having a study like you talked about would definitely never be funded by the CDC or the FDA. It almost need to have like a rogue doctor or like a Paul Thomas, for example, or kind of spearhead that study on their own and find the data and really go out and
No, the CDC has really determined never to do a study comparing health outcomes of vaccinated and unvaccinated children.
Right.
Like children who receive the complete schedule of CDC recommended vaccines versus children who never received a single vaccine.
Right.
The CDC is absolutely determined never to do that study.
Yeah. There's good
not even in the VSC. Like I don't even mean like a prospective, like randomized placebo-controlled study. I don't even mean that. I mean even looking at like VSD data, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is a database that the CDC has with a number of healthcare networks. Mm-hmm. That is not public. It's not like VAERS. It's not like the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, where it's like a public database. The CDC tightly controls access to that data, and they only allow certain individuals and researchers access to that data, but they have that resource available to them. They could use that to compare health outcomes. In fact, the IOM, the Institute of Medicine, recommended that the CDC do that. In one of the papers that the CDC cites to say, I think it was, the vaccines don't cause autism, and they cite an IOM report that actually pointed out that none of the studies included in, which the IOM was charged with reviewing the safety studies, and coming to some kind of conclusion about that. And they actually pointed out that, they concluded that the evidence favors a lack of association, favors the conclusion that the vaccination is not associated with autism. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they acknowledge that none of the studies that they looked at were actually designed to determine whether vaccines can contribute to the development of autism in genetically susceptible individuals, because it's not as though every child is at equal risk of this occurring. Some children, there are genetic susceptibilities that are known. For example, mitochondrial disorders have been identified as a potential risk factor for development of autism. Hannah Poling was a famous case, who at, I believe, 9 months of age received I'm sorry, 19 months of age, received 9 doses of vaccine at once. She had been developing normally. She regressed into diagnosed autism. Her family actually received compensation through the VICP, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program.
Mm.
The government acknowledged that the vaccines caused encephalopathy, the brain inflammation, that manifested as her symptoms of autism. The CDC director at the time, Gerberding, Julie Gerberding, went on CNN and admitted, yeah, we all know that sometimes vaccines can cause fevers, and the fevers can cause, I forget the exact terms she used, but brain inflammation, brain damage, that can manifest as symptoms of autism. And the people who claim that vaccines don't cause autism, the way they deal with that whole admission is to say, well, she didn't say that the vaccines caused her autism. They caused symptoms that were like autism, autism-like symptoms. But the thing is like, okay, autism is defined by its symptoms. It's diagnosed on the basis of its symptoms.
Right.
So they're trying to make a distinction without meaning there.
Right.
So she basically admitted, effectively admitted that, yeah, the vaccines caused fever, which sort of caused inflammation in her brain, which manifested as symptoms of autism.
Right.
So that's a case. Anyhow, the IOM, coming back to that, the IOM. So that's what the Institute of Medicine actually concluded. Actually, none of these studies were actually designed. None of them considered genetic susceptibility. So none of them were actually designed to test the hypothesis. So it's real easy to say, well, the evidence favors the conclusion that there's no association, when none of the studies were designed to determine whether there's an association.
Right.
And anyhow, and then the IOM, of course, I don't remember if it was that same paper or a different paper, but they recommended the CDC to use the VSD to conduct a study that parents are demanding. We want to know, how do health outcomes compare between children who follow the schedule and children who don't get any vaccines? How do health outcomes compare? And the IOM said, the CDC should use the VSD for that. And the CDC has been adamant about refusing to do that study.
Well, the vaccines worked as they claimed. In a sense, there would be no issue of conducting such a study if
they should be the first ones wanting to do it. They should be like, yes, we should do that study. Well, that needs to be done. Let's get into the VSD. Let's get that data. Let's get that done so we can prove to these people and eliminate vaccine hesitancy by proving that vaccinated children are so much healthier than unvaccinated children. Like they should be, biting at the chomp to do that study. But they're
no, that should be the first study that they're lining up to do, because it would if they were to come out and say and have data that proved exactly what they're saying of vaccines are this wonderful, miraculous, like we need to vaccinate every child. If they had that data, of course that they would come out with that. And that
why don't they want to prove their case? Why not?
Right.
Because that's how they could prove it. I mean, that's how they could effectively eliminate vaccine hesitancy, right?
Right.
But I'm using their term. They call it vaccine hesitancy. There's a whole body of literature on quote unquote vaccine hesitancy. But of course, anytime you read any paper in the literature on this phenomenon of vaccine hesitancy, there's always one underlying assumption of every single paper that I've ever seen in the literature on this topic. And the underlying assumption is that there are no legitimate reasons for parents to choose not to strictly comply with the CDC schedule. That's just an assumption.
Yeah.
And so any decision that a parent makes to not strictly comply, for example, you could get every single vaccine on the schedule other than the hepatitis B vaccine. And that's vaccine hesitancy, right? And there's no legitimate reason for any parent to be vaccine hesitant. And that's just an assumption underlying this whole body of literature. Even though, most infants are not at risk for hepatitis B.
Right.
The mother's not a carrier. If there's no carriers in the family, the risk is statistically 0.
Yeah.
So why would you inject your baby with an aluminum containing vaccine when they're at 0 risk of hepatitis B, right? So that seems to me a legitimate reason not to give the hepatitis B vaccine. Right. Seems fairly reasonable to me.
Right.
But they never address like legitimate concerns in any of this literature. They never acknowledge the fact that yes, there are legitimate concerns that parents have. It's always, well, parents are choosing not to vaccinate, and this is vaccine hesitancy, and we need to understand, we need to be able to always the goal of this research is to combat vaccine hesitancy, never by acknowledging the legitimate concerns and addressing those concerns. Just like, how can we produce better propaganda to be able to persuade people to comply with the schedule? It's like, it's more like an exercise in psychology, right? Than in like vaccinology or safety and effectiveness and things like this. They never even touch on those concerns. They just ignore them and dismiss them, as though, again, the underlying premise being that there's no legitimate reason for parents not to strictly comply with the schedule. And so when I use the term vaccine hesitancy, that's pulled straight out of the literature, this whole body of studies that are essentially, how can we produce better propaganda that's more effective, that overcomes this problem of parents thinking for themselves and trusting their own judgment instead of just blindly following the CDC schedule.
Right, exactly. Well, and you can see clearly how the COVID propaganda from the last even just year for the children in terms of getting the needing, quote unquote, needing the COVID vaccine, it's just compounded from what has been taking place for the last 20, 30, 40 years on vaccines in general. Like none of it is actually new in terms of how concerns are addressed, in terms of how they are marketed. I think the CDC might just be one of the biggest marketing agencies in the country in terms of, because what are they doing? They're marketing drugs, they're marketing vaccines.
At no cost to the manufacturers.
Right. Exactly.
The manufacturers don't have to pay for marketing and advertisement. I mean, they do, but they don't have to pay as much for it because they have the CDC doing its job for them.
Right.
The CDC is also a distributor of vaccines. Right. It negotiates contracts with the manufacturers to purchase bulk vaccines, purchase vaccines in bulk, and to distribute them to the states.
Right. Exactly.
It's a distributor. It's a marketer. The CDC, that people have this this perception of the FDA and the CDC, that the government regulates the vaccine industry. No, the government is the vaccine industry. The CDC is the vaccine industry. The FDA is the vaccine industry. The FDA doesn't regulate the vaccine industry. It is the industry.
That's a big.
In fact, going back to the
difference.
the vaccine industry might not even exist today were it not for the government's involvement in the industry in granting legal immunity to the manufacturers. Right. I mean, how many people would have gotten COVID-19 vaccines if they knew, that? Well, I don't know. I guess I was thinking out loud there, but I guess probably more people would have gotten them had they thought that that COVID-19 vaccines that they could sue, right?
Right.
So probably fewer people got them as a result of the knowledge that well, they can't be sued. But most people probably weren't even aware, right? Most people probably weren't even aware that if something happens to them, that they will not be able to sue the manufacturers. That they will not be able to get compensation. I mean, if they have like a permanent injury of some kind that impairs their abilities to work and generate income for their families, what are they going to do?
Right.
I can't sue the manufacturers. There's no way to get, and there is a compensation program. Yeah, just like with the legal immunity that comes under the 1986 law, and they have the VICP program, under the the emergency declarations of the government with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the legal immunity granted specifically to COVID-19 vaccines, which is under a different statute, that there is also a compensation program under that statute, but it's separate from the VICP, and it's even that's even more of a joke than the VICP by leaps and bounds. I mean, I think Wayne Rohde is really the guy to get knowledge from about this. He's written a book about the VICP, and he follows this stuff really closely. But I think I read in one of his fairly recent articles that there's only been one case of compensation occurring so far under this compensation program. I could be misrecollecting. Maybe it's still zero, but I think I recall him writing an article pointing out that there's actually been only one case. So they're not. He wrote an article. It was brilliantly done. It was a short little article, but he efficiently proved that the government has no intention of compensating people for vaccine injuries, because he showed how they actually planned, like they only budgeted to compensate, what was it, like a ridiculously low number of people. Like
Oh,
you could
wow.
count it on one hand kind of thing.
Unbelievable.
So they don't plan on compensating for vaccine injuries. And you look in VAERS at the data. I mean, there are more reports of death following vaccination. Now, VAERS, all the fact checkers, they want you to always emphasize that the VAERS data don't establish causality.
Right.
They don't enable for a control group. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Yeah, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, we all know. But it's alarming. I mean, the whole purpose of VAERS is supposed to serve as a system by which researchers can detect safety signals and then do further research to determine, is there a causal relationship here?
Right.
Is it just an association, but the two things are really unrelated to each other? Or is there something really going on here where the vaccines are actually causing a problem? And the VAERS data are just it's just frightening. Like a higher number of, greater number of deaths reported to VAERS after COVID-19 vaccination than all the other vaccines combined through the entire history of the VAERS program, which VAERS was also established under that 1986 law.
Right.
And it didn't actually get up and running until a few years later, but it was that law that established that system. And so, you look at the VAERS data on injuries and the reported injuries, it's obvious safety signals going on there.
Yeah.
And for them to just dismiss this data, it's interesting how, on one hand, they always assure us that, you don't have to worry about vaccine safety because we have surveillance systems like VAERS. We're closely monitoring, ensure that in the post-marketing experience that adverse events too rare to detect during clinical trials, we can catch them and we'll know because of VAERS. And then when the VAERS does show safety signals, alarmingly, suddenly it's like, oh, you can't rely on VAERS data. It doesn't tell us anything.
Right.
Just ignore it.
Exactly.
I mean, they can't have it both ways.
Well, they've been trying to have it both ways since the beginning of the introduction of vaccines. So it just goes to show you that you can't rely on these institutions that are themselves the vaccine industry to self-regulate. And because if they're going to self-regulate, then they're going to put themselves out of business, because it's a fraudulent business practice using faulty scientific data. And if there are legitimate safety concerns, if they had legitimate safety concerns, it would have been expressed based on we have the VAERS reporting system. And I believe there was a Harvard study done that 1 to 5% of all vaccine injuries are only reported on VAERS. So there's a low number.
It's known. Yeah, it's known that VAERS underreports adverse events.
Right. Exactly.
And more so with milder adverse events than serious ones. So serious adverse events are more likely to be reported to VAERS, but still underreported.
Right.
And then less severe adverse events, it's depending on the adverse event, it can vary. But there was a study, the Harvard study you're talking about, done in collaboration, I think, with Harvard, and I forget what other group, but it was also done in collaboration with the CDC initially, where they described 1%. They used the figure of 1%, as an estimate of the number of adverse events that are actually reported to VAERS. And so their whole purpose was to try to develop a better system. Right. They wanted to develop a way to kind of automate reporting. So, like if there's, you have the records, you have the medical records of the patient, you have, the date of their vaccination, and you have the date of whatever diagnosis. And so it shouldn't be dependent on this passive reporting where, if the doctor is honest and responsible, I mean, they're supposed to by law report adverse events. If the child gets a vaccine, a couple of days later has a severe fever, passes, faints, has seizures, something, they're supposed to report all of that. And of course, obviously this only relates to temporally associated adverse events.
Right.
Obviously, this doesn't apply to like long-term outcomes that you might not manifest for months or years later. But at least you could catch like temporally associated adverse events, and those are all supposed to be reported to VAERS, but they're not. A lot of doctors don't even know about it. It's ridiculous. Right. And even if they do, it's a cumbersome process to try to report these things. And so many, even if they know about it, they might not. And anyone can report to VAERS, not only doctors. Any citizen can file a VAERS report. And the fact checkers like to point this out, like anyone can file the report. It can be a bunch of nonsense. But the thing is like, it's actually a felony to make false claims when you're submitting data to the VAERS database. It's a felony crime. So it's not like you have a bunch of people just, like putting these hoax reports into VAERS.
Right. And it's a lengthy process to actually do the report. Like it would take time just to fill out one actual report. So you're not going to have somebody spending their days submitting 1,000 claims, because I mean they're not going to have the time for that.
Right. Actually, that just triggered a memory of a video I watched interviewing a nurse who was submitting VAERS because she was witnessing adverse events after vaccination with COVID-19 vaccines. So she was filing VAERS reports, and then she started talking to other doctors and nurses in her hospital about this, and finding out like nobody's doing that. Like other doctors were also witnessing adverse events after COVID-19 vaccines, but not doing the paperwork. So she started doing it for them. So she started, like filing these VAERS reports of patients, in that hospital who had adverse events after COVID-19 vaccines, and the hospital shut her down.
Oh, wow.
Like they forbade her from doing that. And I don't recall whether it was just a threat of being fired or whether she was actually fired. But this is an example of how, these are not being reported. And yes, there's significant underreporting of VAERS data. And so when you look at the alarming safety signals coming out of VAERS, with the knowledge that this is underreporting, which isn't to say, there might be a certain proportion of, I'm sure a lot of reports in VAERS are actually not associated with the vaccine, just completely coincidental adverse events. Yes, temporarily associated with the vaccination, but, perhaps even obviously not caused by the vaccine. But, even taking that into consideration, that there's a certain proportion of reported events that are going to be have been caused by the vaccine. We don't know how much, because again, VAERS data can't establish that. All it can establish is an association. But then when you consider again that the total amount of reported is also underreporting of true adverse events caused by vaccines, it's in net, there's underreporting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it goes to show you that with these, I guess, VAERS and all of these institutions, I try and look at like what the future is going to be with vaccines and COVID vaccines in particular, right? And it seems that despite the awakening that you mentioned to this level of truth, they're still talking about adding further boosters. I mean, obviously, up in Canada, it's a different country and they have different things going on, but a similar agenda where Trudeau even came out recently and said, "Oh, to avoid restrictions this winter, we need to reach this vaccination percentage." Right? So they're still using the threats of lockdown and mandates and all of these things to coerce vaccination amongst the population. And I don't know, do you have I guess, an outlook for what you think, how this is going to continue to play out and what people can actually continue to do to arm themselves with truth? Because we're not, these institutions are not going to shut themselves down. They're not going to stop. So I think maybe this awakening needs to just continue to happen at the rate that it is, and
Mm.
eventually we naturally find a way to stand up against that. But I don't know exactly how that looks right now, especially in the immediate future. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think number one is just, the awareness, just helping. I mean, there's still so many people, like you mentioned earlier, who just like they think the CDC is like the authority and this trustworthy agency. There's
Yeah.
still so many people who think, that public health officials are worthy of trust. And so, those who are awakened to the reality, it really is a duty, a responsibility to help educate other people
Yeah.
and help raise awareness, and just pointing out, you know, which can be done with simple examples.
Yeah.
They claimed, number one, that these vaccines, number one, they claimed that natural immunity was weak and short-lived.
Hmm.
They claimed that the vaccines were going to confer superior immunity. They claimed that the vaccines were going to get us to herd immunity. That would be the way to end the pandemic. So that's a claim that the vaccines would induce 2 doses would induce durable sterilizing immunity. Well, all of these claims have been proven false. Everything they said has been proven false. We know with absolute certainty from the scientific evidence that each of these claims was false.
Yeah.
And so there's so many just clear-cut examples of blatant lies from public health officials that, I mean, it's, at this point, for anyone to still believe that the CDC is trustworthy, I mean, that's just outright delusion at this point.
Yeah.
It really is. It's delusional. And so we have to kindly, gently help awaken people to their self-delusion. And we don't do that by going, well, you're delusional. We're not,
Right.
we don't want, because that just puts people on the defensive. So we have to be doing it in a way that's strategically effective, like just raising points that kind of creates this cognitive dissonance in people. Like, well, how can the CDC be trustworthy if, they claimed that the vaccines were superior in August 2021, for example, that the FDA that the CDC explicitly claimed that the vaccines induced superior immunity on the basis of a study, on the basis of a study that didn't include anyone with natural immunity.
Right.
I mean, it's just absurd. It's just absurd. And the AP put out a fact check. Anyone claiming that the natural immunity is superior is wrong. This is untrue. How do we know? Well, because the CDC put out a press release for this study saying that vaccines are superior. And that was the press release for the study that actually everyone included in the study, their immune systems were primed by vaccination. There was nobody in the study who had natural immunity. It's absurd. So, anyways, point being, you can kindly, gently point out that, well, the CDC claimed that the vaccines would be superior, but in August, however, by January, it was clear from their own data, CDC researchers published data in the CDC's own journal showing, falsifying the CDC's claim in August that the vaccines would offer better protection than natural immunity. So the CDC's claim was falsified by its own data. You can point out things like this to people, and get them to just kind of like thinking and realizing, to have them question their own faith. You have to kind of, we want to do it in a kind, gentle way, but that really is one key thing. Like we all need to be active in having, I know from personal experience how difficult it can be to have these types of discussions with like family members or friends. I've lost friends over my positions on issues like vaccines, and my position on lockdowns, masks. Had people unfriend me on Facebook because of things I've said, like saying, well, actually the World Health Organization recommends that children under 5 not be masked, and being unfriended for saying that, things like this. So it can be stressful to try to deal with the people and to try to just share, even just trying to share knowledge in a kind, friendly way, without personal attacks and things. It can be difficult, but we all need to try to make as much effort as we can to do that and just to help raise awareness. So that's one thing. So just educating ourselves and then just sharing that knowledge, spreading the truth and sharing that knowledge. And despite the censorship, you still are able to get truth out on social media. It's very important to be sharing information on social media. I don't agree with the position, like we need to boycott Facebook because Facebook is censoring, for example.
Right.
If I was to just like stop using Facebook, I would be cutting off my own leg.
Yeah.
In terms of like throwing away an opportunity for me to be able to reach a significant audience.
Right.
Why would I do that to myself? Like I can still use Facebook despite the censorship. I can still use Facebook to get the word out and to get the message out.
Exactly.
I can still use Twitter to do that. I can no longer use LinkedIn for that because LinkedIn has banned me for reporting how the CDC's own data falsified its August claim that the vaccines would induce superior protection. For reporting how the media was misrepresenting the findings of a study that showed a 69% lower risk for ivermectin treated patients compared to patients who received the standard of care without ivermectin, as reporting that study as having shown that ivermectin doesn't work. In fact, it was just that the result of the lower risk of death for the ivermectin treated group was not statistically significant, suggesting that the study was simply underpowered, and that had they repeated the study with a larger sample size, that perhaps they would have reached statistical significance, demonstrating a much lower risk of death with ivermectin. So the media completely misinterpreted the study to claim that it showed that ivermectin doesn't work. That is false. So I corrected that, and LinkedIn, blocked my post and cited that as one of the reasons to ban me. So you can't report the truth often. I find LinkedIn is actually the worst of them in terms of censorship. I actually have never been censored on Twitter to date. I have never had a single tweet ever blocked. I've never had my account suspended. They may be shadow banning me. They may have, that's possible. That's something different. But I've never been like outright censored on Twitter. Facebook, I have had posts blocked on Facebook, but and for a while Facebook was penalizing my page, manipulating its own algorithm, so that normally the algorithm would say, oh, well, these people want to know this information from Jeremy Hammond.
Yeah.
We'll show it to them. So they manipulate their own algorithm to say, oh, these people want to see that information, but we're not going to let them.
Right.
That's what they do, right? And so Facebook did at one point notify me that they were penalizing my page that way. But as of now, my page is actually in good standing, and I haven't had any demerits.
All right.
And it's not because I've like changed it's not because I'm self-censoring. I'm not doing that. I don't self-censor.
Right.
I do very carefully think about like, okay, well, obviously I don't want to increase the risk of being censored. So if there is like, for example, I don't share links to like articles where I know that even though the article might contain some good information, they're actually making some other false claims or something.
Right.
I'm very careful about the information that I share. And I am very careful not to share anything that is misinformation.
Right.
Or that contains misinformation. So I am careful about that, but I always have been.
Right. I was going to say.
So I'm not self-censoring in any way. And yet I am still able to get the word out on Facebook and Twitter. Point being, like I just disagree with the position that, well, we should all just quit those platforms. And yes, we should support platforms like MeWe and alternatives that are non-censoring. Yes, absolutely. And I'm on those platforms as well. But I'm not going to throw away the opportunity to reach people who are on Facebook, who are on Twitter, with the message.
Because it is the majority.
Right. And so, I do think, it's just really so important for everyone to be involved in whatever way they can, and just spreading the word, getting the truth out.
Absolutely.
Because you're not going to get it from the government. You're not going to get it from the mainstream media. So it's up to us. Like we all have to like take on this role of essentially being independent journalists and citizen journalists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the conversations, even just in the local community, are important to have, and, in your surroundings. And if you see somebody at this point, if you see somebody wearing a mask, maybe it's an invitation to have a friendly conversation about masks, not in the sense of, oh, you're a fool for still wearing that thing and restricting your breathing, even if that's what you want to naturally think, but have an invitation like, oh, what is it that's compelling your decision to use a mask, right? And sort of try and understand. And because I think
exactly make it about trying to understand. Yeah, that's a perfect example. Yep.
Yeah. I think even the people who are still in the I guess the vaccination cult, whatever you want to call these, really following the CDC guidance. That's like, I don't know, that's like mom and dad for them. Even they still want to understand. And so if they're approached from that way, I think there's a mutual level of, I don't know, learning that can be done for, both perceived sides and kind of eliminate the need for sides to begin with and just commit to truth.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. That's what I've been attempting to do in my own day to day, and I think a lot of people are open to these conversations now, which is good, especially compared to a couple of years ago. I remember it being of 2020, and getting ridiculed because posted something that said the World Health Organization says we should not wear masks while exercising. And
Right.
it's
Right.
right,
Right.
quoting the World Health Organization. It's like, well, they say we shouldn't wear masks while exercising, right? And it's like, okay, and people didn't like hearing that at the time. But now, I
Yeah.
mean, I think people are a little more open, which is good.
That's actually going back to that example. That's the same example I mentioned earlier of like somebody unfriending me on Facebook because I cited the WHO's position on masks of children.
Yeah.
And he was actually, he was a soccer coach and he was talking about how my kids wear masks. They don't complain about it like all these idiot adults.
Hmm.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And so I said, well, actually, the World Health Organization says that children under a certain age shouldn't wear masks, and nobody, adults included, should wear masks while exercising.
Yeah.
Outdoors.
Right.
So it was just like, but just me, and I wasn't being like overly confrontational or combative or anything. I was just saying, well, this is the position of the World Health Organization, actually.
Right.
You'd think it would just be maybe a conversation starter, but no, it was a conversation ender. It's like, nope, block, you're not my friend anymore. You know what
Right.
I mean?
Goodbye. Can't engage in this dialogue. Exactly. Well, and when
So,
you're hit with the sort, like you're throwing, because a lot of times people will say, "Oh, follow the World Health Organization, follow the CDC." When you come back with something that they have directly said, it stumps people, especially if it goes against the narrative that is being presented in the mainstream news. So we can kind of
especially
use
when they change
that.
their own positions and like, well,
Right.
should I do the position of this state or the position of this state that are
Right.
opposite from each other, right? Like,
Exactly. It seems people will just generally say the science has changed, and they'll go with
yeah,
the
the
most
science has
recent.
changed.
They'll go with the most recent update, unless it is not. It doesn't fit. Like I think recently the CDC added ivermectin to their list of medicines that can be used to treat COVID-19. You're still not going to hear anybody actually like say that oh yeah, ivermectin is a possible remedy. Even
It's
though
a
now
horse dewormer.
right, exactly. There's still people who follow that narrative. So I guess I don't know. Maybe there's some people it's like we just need to gently let them sleep and be okay with, let them follow that path as we sort of just continue to open ourselves up to truth.
Well,
Because
that's another really important point. You have to also exercise judgment in like who you attempt to awaken, right? Because there are those people who just, it doesn't matter what facts you give them.
yeah,
They're just never going to change their opinions and their minds. And obviously it's just futile to try to engage with those types of people. And hopefully you can identify them and recognize which ones you can potentially kind of have a reasonable conversation with, and the ones that are just going to, completely put up a wall and personally attack you and things and in friendships and things as a result. I'm not in this to make friends, honestly.
yeah,
If there's someone doesn't want to be my friend because I'm sharing factual information, well, then I don't want to be their friend either.
right,
So that's fine with me. It's more difficult with family members.
yeah,
That's really the biggest challenge. But yeah, in whatever, so, I might not bring stuff up, but if it comes up, I'm going to express my alternative point of view. You know what I mean?
exactly. Yeah, not holding back, especially if somebody asks and it's
Yeah.
or makes a point that's so against the like you talked about masking children, things like that, and vaccines for children. If someone's saying that's something that's potentially dangerous to others, if negligent to truth, I think it is important to have the conversation and correct and ultimately, but so from a place of compassion instead of judgment. Because
Yes. Yeah, that's really important. Like if we are going to be effective in getting through to people, that's really, really important. Yeah.
yeah. So awesome, Jeremy. We're at about 2 hours, and this has been fantastic. Like I said, the work you're doing is always phenomenal. I really enjoy your newsletters in particular because I can tell that you are very careful about the information that you put out. Like it is very well fact checked, it is grounded in truth and an attempt to understand. And I think that message really resonates, which is why I always enjoy talking with you. And I'm sure as this madness progresses down the line and they're rolling out booster number 6 or whatever's going on, they approve some sort of new, or they claim to approve something, we'll just keep the conversation going and
Yeah,
allow it to flow. So um
absolutely. Yep.
so how can the listeners go and access your ebook if they wanted to do that, or find your newsletter and your, obviously you already mentioned all your social medias, and certainly we'll put those in the episode description as well, but where would you want to send the listeners to sort of engage in this more and gain a deeper understanding on what we talked about?
Yeah, if you just head to my website, jeremyrhammond.com. So don't forget the middle initial there. There's another Jeremy Hammond who's people often think confuse me with it, who's a kind of a famous hacker.
Oh.
I'm not that Jeremy Hammond. So I fortunately I always have used my middle initial, which kind of distinguishes me from him.
Yeah.
So it's jeremyrhammond.com. And pretty much any page of my website, you'll see a sign up form for my newsletter. So just enter your name and email in the sign up form and get on my newsletter. And I'll send you the free, as a subscriber, you'll get the free ebook on the FDA's fraud. Also, if you go to the navigation and just click the link to newsletter, it'll take you to the specific sign up page. Just kind of describing the book and what's in it and what you'll get as a subscriber and all that. So you can also just go to that sign up page as well. But pretty much any page of my site, you'll see a sign up form. So just definitely sign up for my newsletter. And of course, all the links to all my social media are included in at the foot of every newsletter. So you can get those that way. But that's definitely the best way to follow my work, is to subscribe to my newsletter.
Yeah. And I would highly recommend it for any listener, because it is, like I said, grounded in truth and the attempt to understand. And like I said, thanks for the work that you're doing and for making the ebook itself, just free with the subscription to the newsletter, because it's valuable information to give people. Like, this is exactly what the FDA and CDC, this is what they are doing, and to lay it out very clearly, like you have, it's a valuable resource, and I think it can definitely awaken people to sort of understand the fraud on a deeper level. Because I myself, I could look at what's going on, and it's obvious there's a fraud involved, but it's good to have the actual, this is what the science says, this is what the data is even showing, and how they exactly manipulate it. So I think it's truly valuable work, and thank you for continuing to pursue the truth like you do.
Well, thanks for your podcast and for having me on as a guest again. I always enjoy our discussions.
Absolutely. And we'll plan on another one in the future. So
Absolutely.
and thanks to all the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you all on the next episode.